All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Recover Seattle, a look at the region's economy. I'm Emily Parkhurst. I'm the president and publisher of the Puget Sound Business Journal. This is a four-part series we're presenting in partnership with the Downtown Seattle Association and Schwabe, Williamson, and Wyatt. During today's discussion, we'll hear from some economic experts about what business leaders need to know about reopening and what they recommend when it comes to restarting the economy and keeping people safe. So with that, please join me in welcoming to today's event DSA CEO, John Scholes. Welcome, John.
Thanks so much, Emily. It's great to be partnering with the Puget Sound Business Journal and Schwabe, Williamson, and Wyatt on this four-part series. If you missed our first event, which was held in early August, focused on the public health response to the coronavirus, you can catch the recording of that on our website. We assembled an expert panel focused on the state of the vaccine and treatments, and also our mitigation efforts to stop the spread of the virus in King County. As Emily noted, this is a four-part series. We aim to bring you, the business leaders in our region, actionable information to help you make decisions within your own organization and company. We look forward to today's event and two additional events in the coming weeks focused on recovery and inclusive recovery here within the Puget Sound region. To provide an overview of today's program, Graciela Gomez-Cowger, the CEO of Schwabe, Williamson, and Wyatt, joins us. Graciela.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Emily. Thrilled to be here. Good morning, everyone. During today's program, we will hear from three experts who are tracking the local economy and watching the recovery closely, particularly when it comes to home sales and the downtown retail and commercial core. We will talk about what they expect in the coming years and even look many years ahead to see how the future will be shaped by this pandemic.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Graciela. We also want to thank the wonderful people at Urban Renaissance Group who've stepped up to support this series. Urban Renaissance Group is a Seattle-based full-service real estate company focused on investing, building, and managing great buildings. And URG believes in the power of place, so we want to thank them for supporting this region and all its special places by helping us produce today's information-packed program. So now we are excited to welcome the amazing panel that we have for today's discussion. Please join me in welcoming Matthew Gardner, who's the chief economist for Windermere Real Estate. At Windermere, Matthew is responsible for analyzing economic data and its impact on the real estate market. He's also on the Washington State Governor's Council of Economic Advisors. Welcome, Matthew.
Good morning, Emily. Hello, John. Hello, Graciela.
Welcome.
Please also welcome Glenn Hiemstra, the CEO and founder of Futurist.com. Glenn is an internationally known author, consultant, and speaker on future trends and long-range planning. So welcome, Glenn.
Hi, everyone.
And also please join me in welcoming Pat Callahan, who's the founder and CEO of Urban Renaissance Group. In addition to his duties running the commercial real estate investment development and property management company, Pat is also a governing trustee at the Urban Land Institute. So welcome, Pat.
Thank you, Emily. Good morning, everyone.
Graciela, I'll turn it over to you to throw out the first question.
Thank you, Emily. All right, panelists, here we go. Let's jump right in. As a former engineer and really self-proclaimed data geek, I'm curious to know, what data metrics are you watching right now, and what are some of the trends that are starting to play out as we move into the 6th month of the pandemic and a more longer-term focus?
Well, I'll dive in first because my data is the most general, and then our two real estate experts can probably talk more specifically. I'm paying attention first of all to the COVID data, because until we have that under control and in a sense solved, we just don't get back to a full economy. So paying attention to cases, deaths, and so on is still top of the list for me. And this is particularly true for downtowns, because people are just not going to return to downtowns very much. That is the restaurant scene and the entertainment scene and so on, until that's well under control. So that's data point number one. The second is there's some interesting data coming out on the kind of the percentage of economic activity that's happening state by state. I think that we're about 80 to 83 or 4% of previous economic activity is going on in the state, which is kind of interesting when you look at the empty cities. So I'm paying attention to that. And then I'm also really trying to pay attention to sort of the futurist research community and what they're thinking about the very long term of, office versus home, organizational culture, and how that might change and those kinds of things. So that's sort of more opinion, I suppose, than data. But there's a real mixture of opinion in the futurist research community about, are changes that we're seeing permanent, or are they really just temporary? And in a couple of years from now, we'll all look in the rearview mirror and be more or less like it used to be. And there's real debate about that in the community. So that's what I'm watching.
I think in general, we've tended to start looking more now at high frequency data. I mean, looking at stuff on a monthly grain just doesn't cut it anymore. And so the kind of numbers I'm looking at, initial unemployment claims, obviously very important. King County last week was about 5,800. That is a lot better than it was. But in essence, the region's running at about a multiplier of 3 to 4 times what it should be pre-COVID. That's one thing I'm looking at. Other ones tend to be more nuanced. Open Table provides me some great data on who's making restaurant reservations. And quite frankly, we are not. We are down in Seattle by 82% from where we were a year ago. So it could be worse. We were at 100%. And so that is not looking that good. Apple Mobility also, that brings out some good data, tells me we are driving more, we are walking a lot more, but we're not using mass transit. Now, mass transit is going to be important. As that starts to trend up, it's going to be a very significant indicator that people are going back to work. So those are the major ones that I'm tracking right now. And finally, hotel bookings. Visit Seattle always have some fantastic data on that, and it is, quite frankly, quite ugly, or rather glum. I mean, you've got an occupancy rate downtown Seattle right now of 16.5%. And give you a better idea, it should be somewhere in the mid-70s. So those are the major things I'm looking at. So I think the bottom line is, and what I'm seeing is, it is certainly better than it was, but we are certainly not where we need to be, quite frankly. So it's getting there, but it's just taking a lot longer, I think, than many people had anticipated.
So I would just add maybe a few things. So first, to what Glenn said about paying attention to the COVID data. I mean, ultimately, there's the near-term stuff that was just described, but your investment is based on a longer horizon, right? So having a view in terms of when we're going to get to a post-COVID environment is important for investment, for sure. The details that we're kind of looking at would be, one, delinquencies and receivables, and as a gauge of how bad it is and who is going to survive and who's not going to survive. We have over 500 tenants, so it's a pretty good view into the economy just looking at that. Now, generally speaking, collections are great. The pain is focused on a few people, right? And restaurants in particular, and a few others. We also are paying attention to how many people are coming to work every day in the office, and that's I think a measure of how safe do people feel. Whatever your safety calculation is, whether it's related to social unrest or COVID, do you feel comfortable coming in? And I'll share some of those numbers later.
Matthew, Glenn, and Pat, thanks again for being with us today. I wanted to get your perspective on the pace of recovery in our region. And as Glenn noted, so much of that depends on our ability to continue to effectively manage the spread of the virus. So there's some assumption built in here that we all have to make when we talk about the pace of recovery. But what is your perspective on the pace of recovery for our region? And what do you believe are some of the unique assets that we have relative to other metro areas across the country? What are some of the liabilities and things that might hold us back?
Well, I think from a timing perspective, we are getting there, but it's slow. And as was mentioned earlier, I sit on Governor Inslee's Council of Economic Advisors, and Governor Inslee is very, very focused on the numbers, and he's looking at them on multiple times in one day. So, but I think it's going to be a function really of that management that you mentioned, the bonus or the advantage we have here in Seattle, as opposed to many other markets, I even cite California and certainly the South, most of us are behaving and understand the fact that we need to embrace social distancing. We need to embrace mask wearing. It's not taking away anything from ourselves individually when you have to look at the greater collective. So as an economist, I'm a great believer in short-term pain leading to longer-term gain. And so I think that the more we continue to do what we are supposed to do, then the faster I believe that we can open. Are we there yet? Absolutely not. But I think we are certainly doing better than a large part, and certainly the Midwest specifically, swath of the country who really are not, really, I think, holding a lot of us back.
So I would say the other advantage that we have as a region is the amount of office space that is leased by the big 5 tech companies. So in our data, so this is based on today, including future commitments by those 5 tech companies, Amazon and Microsoft obviously having the biggest presence here. They represent 34% of the office space in this market, including owned real estate. That number is way ahead of even, you know, the Valley in San Francisco overall. And if you compare that to small cities across the country, they might have 1% penetration, right, of the big 5 tech companies. Now, and that 34% number does not include all the other 10 companies that are in this market. So I think, you know, what's driving the stock market today is the fact that tech companies are going to prosper in some way because of this crisis, because everything is becoming more automated, artificial intelligence, all the reasons that we know about. And so that's our advantage, and not every region has that advantage.
There's a lot to follow, Pat, but I think it's Emily's question, so I'm going to let her ask it next. But Glenn, I want to get your
I'll just add a couple of things. Thinking longer term, obviously, you know, the general attractiveness of the area is, you know, always an advantage for us and continues to be. In fact, my son-in-law, who's a Google worker, has been up here working remotely. They live in San Francisco, my daughter and he, and they were slated to head back, but the fires are keeping them here. So, you know, and if you think very long term, if we can manage our forests, which is an interesting thing to think about, if we can manage our forests and remain more environmentally attractive by not having as much smoke and so on, that's going to be an advantage. The big disadvantage that, you know, that we have is quite obvious to everybody is that we're very travel dependent. Some of our big industries and obviously the hotel business and all of that. And of all the things that we're aware of, the thing that will probably come back the most slowly is significant amounts of travel. I don't think we return to 2019 levels of travel for a minimum of 5 years before we're back to that level. So, and even then, you can question whether we'll ever go back to quite the level that we were racing around the world in 2019, at least over the next few years. So that's a disadvantage. That's a headwind, as Matthew might say, that we're going to be facing for the next few years.
And Pat and Matt, you were both pretty positive and offered what you thought were assets, but what about quickly liabilities? What do you think our greatest liabilities are to recovery that are unique to this region?
Capitol Hill. I think that in all seriousness, I think that when you look at what's still going on, although certainly it's not as bad as we're seeing down in Portland, that's a hindrance, there's no doubt. But in terms of COVID related, again, it's as much as Glenn mentioned, I mean, economics is certainly the dismal science, but we do appear to be doing the right thing. But I think the long-term projections, for me, the concern is going to be, are we going to see a migration out of our cities, both from a residential as well as a commercial standpoint? I'm sure Pat and I will be talking about that a little bit later on. But it is going to be that movement or the potential for movement. And certainly a lot of people have been kind of waxing poetic about the flight to the suburbs, both from a residential as well as potentially an office perspective and a move away. And also, if we are not going to be working from our offices on a full-time basis, does that mean we have to live closer? One of the biggest issues obviously then is affordability, because it's more expensive to live closer to where we are. If people people may say, okay, if I only have to be in an office twice a week, then I will put up with a really lousy commute, but I can buy a home in Pierce County for 1/3 of what it would cost me in Seattle. But I think there's some longer term connotations there as well on the negative side, and that's about as negative as I can get.
Yeah, and I guess my negative is the social unrest. You don't really realize how the perception of Portland and Seattle has been impacted until you talk to others across the country, and they're like, "Are you in crisis? What's going on? Are you okay?" You know, and you're like, "Yeah, we're fine." But I think that is a negative, and hopefully there's a resolution to that unrest and progress there soon.
Yeah, we had a couple of questions come in while you guys were talking about basically the impact of the protests and some of the other things that Seattle has ended up in the national headlines for, and how much of the concern that you have for the downtown core is related to that versus the pandemic. So I'll kind of throw that out there as we've had 3 or 4 questions from the audience around that topic. So I'll throw that out there, but I want to talk about the future of the office and what that looks like. So I'll throw it to you first, Pat, but while I do that, I'm going to launch a poll question for the audience here, asking them when your company or organization is planning to return to the office, and if you aren't there currently. So Pat, can you talk a little bit about what you expect the future of the office to look like?
So I think, you know, there's been a lot of attention paid to the idea that folks are going to be working from home permanently and not needing to go to the office, and I feel that's highly unlikely, and because there's a lot of reasons to be in person with one another, whether that's because of culture or mentoring or crucial conversations or decision making. There's a reason to be together. And I think what you're seeing is that everyone expects and really is demands in this environment, in this world today, a ubiquitous desktop. I mean, you try to be effective everywhere, right? You on the bus, on the ferry, in the car, in the office, in the home, you're working. You know, you're dealing with personal and work stuff constantly. And I think people really are seeking to be productive in all venues. And the things that we've learned during this crisis will allow us to do that.
And piggybacking on what Pat said, I think is right. We tried this great experiment, I think it must have been almost 2 decades ago. Everyone's going to be working from home. The glamorous idea, kind of roll out of bed in your bunny slippers and have at it. It failed, and it failed then. And I think it will do the same thing again, as Pat mentioned. I think there's a couple of things which happened last time around, obviously not pandemic induced, that we will see again. One's going to be training, very hard to do. And secondly, is that symbiosis of the discussions you have in a hallway around the water cooler. And so I ultimately see the potential for productivity declines the more we are apart. My example is always this: I could have somebody in my office come and kind of stand by my doorway for 3 minutes to have a conversation about something. Well, that 3-minute conversation has become a half-hour Zoom call, which, if you think about it from a productivity standpoint, it doesn't work. So I agree with Pat wholeheartedly. I think training is going to be very hard, and I think that productivity has the potential, if the view is we will be working, or a lot of us will be working remotely on a more permanent basis. There are going to be headwinds in that respect, I believe, and I think it will make us potentially less productive and not more.
Yeah, let me add just
Glenn,
a little. Yeah, can I add to that?
Of course, I'm just going to share the results while you do,
Good.
so people can see what the results of the poll were.
Oh, I'm curious. See, only 7% working permanently. Here, quick history perspective. Late 1970s, maybe 1978. I'm in Spokane at Whitworth College. The president is probably the best futurist in this state ever. A guy named Ed Lindemann. You guys would know who he was. And he's teaching a seminar. I'm in the seminar, and he's saying, well, the personal computer revolution is on the horizon, and this means that people are going to disperse back to villages and live in villages, because they'll be able to work with their personal computers. Didn't happen. 1995, I was on a panel in downtown Seattle. It was probably sponsored by the Business Journal, perhaps, or by the Chamber or somebody. It was on the future of telecommuting. I was on a panel with another local consultant named John Niles. The moderator was Bill Nye, the science guy. Before he was very well known, he was hilarious. But the keynoter was Craig McCaw, one of the pioneers in cellular telephones. In the keynote, I've never forgotten his line. He said, "In the future, we will travel to get together, but not to do most basic work." And so I thought, well, this is it. We're all going to be telecommuting, and here we are. And again, everybody thought we would disperse to the countryside and to the suburbs and telecommuting, and didn't happen. This shock, of course, is very great, and it is true that the technology now for working remotely is much better than it was in 1995 and certainly than in 1978. But I tend to agree both with the poll that we just saw and with the comments that have been made that most people will return to office culture when it's feasible to do so. There will obviously be some, probably more remote work, as there gradually has been, but I don't see it being as nearly as big a permanent move as some speculate that it might be.
And I think that, you know, I'll just interject here. I think it's worth remembering that in some fields, we really do need those collaborative juices to be flowing to create innovation and to create invention. And you can't really do that effectively. You can get by, but at some point you're going to need all those engineers and data scientists and scientists to be back talking to each other around the water cooler that will help spark ideas as between different teams and different projects and innovation. So I do believe that is a matter of principle. We can do some of this, and we can probably only need to go into the office twice a week, maybe, but we'll need to do that in conjunction with our team that's going to be there at the same time so that we can have that collaboration and innovation. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's good. That's essentially what Craig McCaw was saying, by the way, which was we'll travel to get together, and he added, and so we'll travel to get together for meetings and for creative sessions and for retreats and for all kinds of things that we want to be in the same room with people for, but we may not necessarily sit and type in an office 8 hours a day. But even, you know, if we only traveled in 2 days a week, that's a massive change. If that was really true, I think that even that may be more of a stretch. I think still most people will probably still go back to the office most of the time. For one thing, people are discovering that they're working from home is really not for everybody, at least not full time. It's not necessarily great for family life, not necessarily great for relationships. You know, our homes are not necessarily set up for it, et cetera, et cetera.
And the cities obviously are much more than places where people come to work. And I want to get your perspectives on the other aspects of city life and shopping, arts and culture, dining. And there's plenty of people predicting the death of cities after this pandemic, and that we're all going to spread ourselves out and not participate in those activities in the heart of our cities. But beyond work, what's your perspective and outlook on the health of urban areas, of our downtowns, of our cities?
Well, I don't want to talk too much, but I'll dive in and then see what the others think. I think that 2 or 3 years from now, once COVID is truly behind us, there will be an explosion of activity in cities, a rush back to cities. This is my prediction. It'll be sort of a joyful celebration of being back in cities. There will probably be a lot of need for new restaurateurs or new entrepreneurs trying out restaurants and so on because of the trouble that we see in the restaurant industry, but the restaurant industry, the travel industry, and the entertainment industry are just, you know, that's what cities are really all about in many ways, in addition to the work in the offices. And I think that we'll see a rush back to that. But we'll see. I mean, there's a lot that has to happen positively, a lot of investment that's going to have to happen for that all to come to fruition. But just like the sort of the roaring 20s followed the flu pandemic of 1918, one can imagine something like that later in the 2020s.
My biggest concerns are in 2 sectors. One's restaurants, one's retail, and that's ground floor retail. In both respects, margins are remarkably slim. It makes it very hard for them to survive or even to recover. And if you look at Main Street retail, certainly our attention is obviously now focused on Amazon. Everyone's getting packages delivered, I'm sure, on a daily basis. And that's great. However, if you look at our smaller retailers, their shelves are stocked with product that they've had to buy that's now sat there gathering dust. How long can they continue before they either fold or hopefully come back out of this? And the same thing in the restaurant industry. Now, it obviously has intricate ties to residential, to urban residential. People moved downtown. They started back in the mid-90s in essence because of capital expenditures. And so, and part of that was going to be not only what the government's spending money on, but certainly you're seeing more restaurants, more bars, more retail there. And if that does not, or if that's a lot slower coming back, that certainly has the potential to impact our urban residential market. I think far less, however, here than in markets such as San Francisco, Manhattan, Manhattan certainly is suffering massively right now. So I'm watching those two areas very closely, and I hope very much that we will see them recover. But they are going to be struggling, I think, for a fairly long time.
Are you seeing, Matthew, any indications in the housing market today on preferences for multifamily versus single family in Seattle and in the county that give you some indication, at least on the short-term shifts or trends?
Yeah, and obviously I took a close look at that over the course of the last few days, and quite frankly, we haven't. Now, we've seen increasing listing activity. Sure, we're still down, what, in the city, 13% year over year, but we're seeing a slowing down in list price growth, and that's always an interesting indicator as well. On the multifamily side, certainly, far less on single family, and of course, the city of Seattle, 70% of our land is zoned single family, as ridiculous as that is, but it is what it is. But when you talk about the urban multifamily product, I think you're finding a lot of companies have to be far more considerate now of how adequate is their HVAC system. What are they doing in terms of cleaning protocols? I think a lot of people moved into these urban environments with the view that they could have kind of yoga classes together and cooking classes. Well, that's not going to happen. So how is that going to morph? And I think it won't go away, but there will be a change. A lot of that now will start becoming almost remote. So you will be in your unit doing a combined cooking lesson with everyone else in their units and not collectively. So we will certainly see some changes in that respect. But in terms of this, the belief that we'll see a mass migration out to the suburbs, no, I haven't seen it in the data at all quite yet. So, and that I think is going to be the case. I would expect to see it far less here because, quite frankly, our urban environment is not very substantial. It's remarkably small. But I do expect to see that happening, as I mentioned, in markets like the Bay Area, certainly San Francisco. We are already seeing it in Manhattan. So those remarkably dense cities, I think you will see that. I just think it's more unlikely to see. The biggest concern I have in Seattle, quite frankly, is still price. It's affordability as much as anything else. And it's certainly nothing that's going to be COVID induced.
So since I'm at Urban Renaissance Group, I feel compelled to comment on your question, John. So I guess, you know, if you walk around downtown Seattle, downtown Portland, pick your downtown right now, it doesn't feel great, right? And that's a reason you asked that question. On the other hand, if you think about thousands of years of history and the fact that our cities have disproportionately felt the impact of social and economic upheaval, there's many crises that have occurred in our major cities across the world for thousands of years. And yet they survived and they came back and they thrived. And I think there's a reason for that that's unique to the human experience, and that in and of itself is going to make sure that cities recover. It's going to take some time, but it will recover. I think specifically in cities, a rethinking of the first floor space, the at-grade space to the sidewalk, is going to be necessary, right? That we're not going to have the same retailers there that we had at one time. Maybe it's more common space. Maybe the rent expectations are lower. But there is a reimagining that has to happen there, and I think all people with forethought are trying to figure that out right now.
It's a really good point. It's a really good point.
Hey, Pat, I wanted to ask you a follow-up question that's also come up in the questions from the audience here. do you expect to see office prices and retail prices, lease prices downtown start to drop, or are they going to stay steady? What's that going to look like?
Well, right now it appears steady. They certainly have stopped growing, and what you're seeing in some cases that there's more sublease space available, or potentially maybe. Right now you have two kind of different sets of decision making. You have people in firms in crisis financially that are making immediate decisions to shed space, go entirely work from home because they're trying to save the company from financial disaster, right? Those are decisions that are occurring that are not of long-term impact. Then you have others that are making strategic decisions right now about how do they respond to the post-COVID world and what are the business realities and outcomes in that world. And so those are different things. So there could be some pressure on rental rates. That hasn't been obvious to date. And probably of note in answering that question is institutional investors haven't stopped being interested. They may have stopped investing this year because they don't need to invest this year, but they're all gearing up for investments in 2021. And so at that level, that high level institutional allocation of capital doesn't appear to be any concern about Seattle whatsoever.
Okay, interesting. Well, I want to direct a question at Glenn, but Matthew and Pat, please feel free to weigh in on this. What innovations, Glenn, are you seeing come out of this crisis that you think, as you look forward, will become mainstream or even potentially disrupt some traditional industries?
Well, let me mention two or three. One, just reinforce what Pat just said about sort of rethinking ground level in cities, which goes along the lines of rethinking perhaps even streetscapes to some degree. If you look at Koreatown in Manhattan and so on, and the move of restaurants into the streets, maybe that's just a temporary thing, but it might also be an opportunity to sort of rethink a little bit about how we do indoor outdoor seating, and use the streets. And that's an interesting innovation in terms of rethinking the kind of the pedestrian, people friendly and so on environment of a city. So I find that intriguing, and that you can think of that more as a social innovation, I suppose. Getting very specific, the X Prize, the X Prize Foundation has a $1 million X Prize going on for a new mask. And they expect they're picking their finalists in early November and are going to pick the winner for the $1 million by the end of November. I think it's by November 20 or something like that. So maybe if we're all still have to wear a mask for another 6 to 12 to 18 months, maybe there will be some fascinating breakthrough there, which would actually be very, very welcome for everybody. There's been a lot of innovation, obviously, during the COVID crisis around meeting technology, including the kinds of things that we're doing precisely right now. It's kind of interesting, in fact, how much this crisis has pushed, with beginning with Zoom, but then pushed Google and Microsoft and others to significantly rethink, upgrade, and work harder on their multi-person meeting. Remote meeting technologies. So that's there. And then I happen to be acquainted with the longtime, very veteran director of research at NASA, Langley. And I called him in the spring and said, so what's up and what are you working on? And how are you going to keep the space program going when nobody can be in the same room? And he said all of his personal research time was devoted now to HVAC and NASA itself was putting an effort then into trying to look at the future of HVAC and what can be done both in retrofit, but then especially in any kind of new construction to make HVAC that essentially removes pathogens from the air. Whether that's he was most bullish on various kinds of ultraviolet light technology, and it's pretty hard to imagine that we won't come out of this with some breakthroughs and perhaps even some new standards there. That's partly because, one of the great epidemiologists is Larry Brilliant, who was involved in the eradication of smallpox and and then was involved in the earlier SARS and those kind of things. And he argues right now, he's been arguing in the last 6 months that this COVID pandemic is probably the harbinger of several pandemics to come over the next 50 years or so, because of the size of the population and our intermingling with formerly wild animals and so on. He said it's pretty inevitable that we'll have, you know, more of these. Maybe we'll do a much better job globally than we've done with this one in managing it and not letting it get to a pandemic. But what that suggests to me is that something like innovation in mass or innovation in HVAC may not be a temporary thing. It might be just a thing that becomes part of what we are. So those are two or three. The one that actually intrigues me the most in some ways is you know, what's the long-term impact on the streetscape in cities, and what kind of innovation from you on the investor sides and you know, design, construction, and so on sides to the users. You know, what's going to happen
And
to
Glenn,
retail and so on.
just
So that's interesting enough.
to go on those questions and trying to marry two ideas that we've thought of. You know, I always think about these situations, of course, as opportunities, and we all search to figure out where's the angle here that we could work out a positive outcome. And one of the issues that we've talked about is the streetscape and the you know, Pat mentioned the bottom floor retail. Is there an opportunity here, for example, to rethink how we are investing in BIPOC and other communities, disadvantaged, non-majority communities, to encourage them to take risks and to establish businesses and to take up that lower level retail and to revamp and start off those restaurants that are suffering and closing now, and fund them appropriately and help provide impetus to allow help them take those risks, so that we could both invest in our communities and address some of the issues and some of the divisiveness that exists, and also revamp our cities and prepare them for the future.
Yeah, it seems to me the answer to that could be yes, and probably should be yes. And they're clear, whether that comes from the philanthropic world or whether that comes through. I was thinking, you know, if I could wave a magic wand over the federal government in another round of fiscal stimulus to support businesses, I'd really look at basically small retail and restaurants, but especially restaurants, and ask, you know, what could be done specifically in that arena if we're going to provide any kind of financial support. And if you did that, of course, through government means, then it makes even more sense that it would be aimed at the BIPOC community as a way of dealing with more than one issue at one time. So that's a really good idea.
I think I was throwing in my housing hat on. The return of the home office. Houses actually becoming smaller and have been for the last 15 years or so. I think it's going to turn the table. I think we're actually going to start seeing houses become larger again. Again, we're going to get away from that open plan, but certainly, I'm not sure how many of you have been working from your dining room table for the last several months. I know I am still. And so I think that I do expect to see some construction changes on the residential side to create dedicated home workspaces, which we had been getting rid of for several years now.
Makes sense.
Anything, Pat?
No, I'm good. I mean, it's a great idea. I wrote it down. We're going to try that.
Pat, are any of your tenants calling to ask you for these NASA engineered HVAC systems yet?
Yes. So maybe I'd start with this. So I know some people call this the new normal, and I do not call it the new normal. What I would call it is we've moved from a pure crisis to a managed crisis, but we're still in crisis, I would say. And there will be a normal eventually, and we're all trying to figure out when that is. And so in this managed crisis, there's a lot of things that we've learned, and I'll use our space as an example at our headquarters. We've established a bunch of rules, right, about how you circulate, taking your temperature when you come in, and all of the tenants have done the same thing. And that has led to increases in occupancies that are quietly occurring in downtown office space. So in general, where we were in June in terms of people actually coming into the office, about 10%. About 10% of the people were doing that, or 10% of the time, let's call it. And now that's moved to about 20%. And the reason that has occurred, I think, is that people feel like the COVID crisis is being managed well. We know what the rules are. You have to put masks on. You have to distance. You need to, for example, we're totally evacuating the air in buildings every night and turning it around. Things like that you can take advantage of before you spend a bunch of money on new filters that haven't been proven yet, right? So there's a lot of stuff like that going on that had made people feel more comfortable to come back in the office. Now, 20% is low, but it is movement. And I will use another example that the ferries on the Bainbridge to downtown Seattle run have just gone back to full, ferry schedule, right? Not 50% schedule. And there's a reason they did that, because there's demand to come into downtown Seattle because people are going to work a little more often. And so those are the types of things that we're seeing. And generally we're getting a lot of the questions still that you've asked, but there's been so much implemented. The tenants are feeling pretty comfortable with the protocols, both that we've adopted in managing the building and that their employer has adopted.
Yeah, I can echo that, Pat, just from our experience in our building and in our office today with the Vance Corporation, the steps they've taken and the steps that we've had to take as an organization. We certainly know more today than we did in March and April about how to manage this crisis. I want to get each of your perspectives on the role of the historic level of federal investment that was made both to companies, small businesses, and workers over the last several months that is now largely expired and evaporated. In many ways, it cushioned the economic crisis to some degree that we were experiencing as companies and workers. What is your outlook should the federal government not act on a second, or I guess it would be a fourth at this point, stimulus investment? Do you fear a spiral downward in where we've been economically in our region? Can we afford not to see additional investment from the feds?
I think that last statement is the most appropriate. Can we afford not to? Are there long-term impacts? Absolutely. We're ballooning the national debt. We have a budget deficit right now. It's going to hit $4 trillion this year. But quite frankly, I'm a Keynesian economist. So Keynes would say absolutely. Friedman would say absolutely not. There's no free lunch and that kind of thing. We really had no choice. However, are there going to be consequences? Yes. We need to spend the money. However, our children and our grandchildren are going to be paying for it. So there is a long-term implications in that respect. But I think also, if we do, well, when we do it again, we need to be far more accurate at where we direct these funds. I think the likelihood that they should go to the Harvard endowment is probably not appropriate. So because it is those, as we've all discussed, Pat and Glenn, it is a small business that runs this country, and it is those people that we really need to be helping. Now, if we don't do it, what we will see immediately, relatively speaking, is an increase in the unemployment rate. That will start spiking again as PPP kind of wears off. So be watching that, because again, that's not going to be appropriate. We've managed to get our unemployment rate in King County now around some seasonal adjustments, and it's around 8.5% today. Not a bad number, quite frankly, relative to what it could be. So we are in those high single digits, but we need to have that support. Now, some will argue that no, we can't keep on throwing. I mean, I think the helicopter money, the $1,200 is ridiculous. I think that if you look at where that money went, it went into the stock market, which is kind of surprising. You look at Robinhood and these companies, you can buy fractions of a share. So everyone now owns kind of 1/1,000,000th of an Amazon share. Great. So I don't think that was the way to do it. But further fiscal stimulus is going to be important, but it needs to be targeted appropriately. But there will be a significant bill. We're not, what, $25 trillion is the national debt roughly today. It's going to be something that's going to be around for generations, not just decades.
So I would, there certainly will be an impact if there's not additional stimulus. And, basically if you take the category of small retailers, whether that's, a lunch place, a dinner place, a salon, they don't have a lot of cushion. They don't have a year of revenue in the bank, right? And so essentially by perhaps delaying rent payments for a couple months and getting stimulus money and PPP money, they were able to survive 3 or 4 months and, you know, are operating right now still. And it's going to be a matter of, with some of these folks, either stimulus happens or we need to forgive rent longer, right? Or they go down, right? And so, I mean, landlords are going to be making that decision, and the individuals are going to be making that decision. Sometimes they just say it's too hard, right? I'm going to go do something else. And so I think there is a risk of greater economic fallout of significance if there's not more government support. And I agree with everything Matthew said in terms of there's downside to that. Understand that, but there's downside currently as well if we don't do it.
And I would be remiss to not mention that, of course, the economic impacts of unemployment and otherwise inordinately affect not only minority populations, but women, especially as they take on the additional role of or the larger portion of caregiving for kids now being at home. So I think we're going to see a gap there, and that's just a good segue, I think, to a question Emily has about schools. But I think the equity gap is going to grow, and as students have different access to different materials as we start again online in the fall.
Absolutely, thanks for that, Graciela. You know, one of the things that has come up a couple of times in discussions recently is about that equity gap in terms of access to the tool needed to go to school this fall, you know, whether that's devices or workable internet. So let's just talk a little bit about schools briefly here. Schools drive home sales in particular neighborhoods. If you can go to school from anywhere, how does, you know, this kind of crisis change the way we think about neighborhoods? And I'm curious, as families are managing, you know, both work from home and their kids going to school from home, how you all think this is going to affect productivity and the economy kind of in general. And I guess with the housing question, I'll throw this to you first, Matthew.
Sure, and you're absolutely right. I mean, certainly housing, school districts do influence home prices, no doubt about it. Has this had an impact thus far? No, because I think so many parents, including myself, are praying that at some point my youngest William will actually end up going back to school. So I think you have to take a longer view on it. If this was going to be something that's more permanent, then I think it could have fairly significant impacts in certain markets because of those school districts. But I think given the fact that most believe that it will not be a permanent state of affairs, it has yet to have an impact. But as was also mentioned, my concerns that I do have, even through this next quarter, are going to be areas with lower incomes and their ability to have their children effectively go to school. Now, certainly companies like Amazon, Comcast, Xfinity are giving a lot of things in terms of either bandwidth or materials or tablets to assist, but I think it's kind of a thumb plugging a dike, and I really look at it in the longer term that it will have absolutely the potential for a disproportionate effect on those lower income households. But in terms of homes, the belief that we will, at least possibly in the spring, be going back to our schools, it needs to be a longer impact to have any form of significant effect on home prices. And certainly I believe that most parents, like myself, are cross-fingered that will not be the case.
Yes,
if I could add on schools, just I want to think about universities just a little bit, and kind of cycle back to the financial support piece. I'm really watching. We're sort of doing it backwards. One could argue right now in terms of schools, we're putting the kindergarten kids in front of Zoom and sending the college kids back to the dorms in the classroom and hoping everything works out. And right now, the evidence of the schools that are opening isn't great on the case side. So one can imagine that it's going to be very financially difficult for colleges and universities over the next year or two. And so we may, as a society, but at the state level in particular, need to ask, need not just ask, but answer the question, how important is it to maintain these colleges and universities and help them through this period until they can get back to kind of their full revenue models, because it's pretty hard to see how they're going to get through this.
And I agree with Glenn. I mean, you can't cut full tuition for online learning, doesn't work. And so I think revenues, without a doubt, are going to have to be impacted.
What we're seeing too is a lot of these colleges and universities are putting their campuses up for sale now, more and more, which is an interesting trend. Pat, I'll turn it over to you in just a second. I want to launch this other poll because I'm really curious. While you answer that, how often people are going into their workplace, because obviously that does affect the schooling question, and how that impacts the productivity as well. So, Pat, do you want to dive into that while we wait for folks to take the poll?
I would say the announcements by a lot of major employers about delaying return to the office, I think has as much to do about uncertainty in the school situation as it does with COVID concerns returning to the office. I think that uncertainty that's existed for months about, are you going back? Are the kids going to be home? That has created a level of anxiety among my employees and all employees, that they're like, oh my God, don't make it more complicated, right? So that's why employers have said, okay, we're waiting until January 1st, or we're waiting to March 1st, or whatever it is. So at least the parent could plan around that portion of it. And we still don't know if this thing about going back to school is going to hold. Right now, it doesn't feel like it.
It's interesting too, when you look at the results here, just how mixed that really is.
Wow, straight across.
Graciela, I'll hand it off to you here.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so here's a final question for you guys. Many companies frame their strategic planning in 5-10 year increments. It's a little longer term typically. It often includes both short and long term, but it's really focused on the long term effects. Many of our clients and Schwabe alongside them are beginning the process of reevaluating their strategic plans through a post-pandemic lens, right? Because everything has changed. So we are due to take a look at how those changes have impacted our plans, even if they're not due for a refresh. We understand with COVID, most of these long-term planning really has gone out the window. Long-term now refers to maybe 3 months chunks and not 5-10 years. As our clients and us look to revamp their strategic plans, what advice do you have for them, and how should they be considering, and what should they be considering as they engage in this process?
Well, I'll say just two things. One, I'm advising clients not to make long-term decisions based on responding to COVID unless they would be making the same long-term decisions if there was no COVID. So, because I think the 18 to 24 month period is still so uncertain in terms of what comes out of this that's more permanent, and what comes out of it that turns out to have been fairly temporary. So that's one sort of hold on really long-term decisions. I'm fascinated by the REI headquarters decision, for example. Is that a COVID decision? I haven't talked to anybody there. Is that a COVID decision, or was that otherwise a decision they were going to make long-term anyway? If it was one they were going to make anyway, that's the kind of long-term decision you want to make. We would do this even if there was no COVID. Therefore, let's go ahead and plan for this 5 or 10 year horizon. The second is I would develop a future vision, at least a scenario that sort of assumes we solve COVID. We don't really need to wear masks, and we don't need to socially distance. We don't need to do all this stuff we're doing. So it's not quite a back to normal scenario, but it's let's call it just a normalcy scenario. What do we want to look like in that world, and have at least contingency plans to move in that direction once it becomes more clear whether, for example, a vaccine is going to help us through the next 12 months or not. So those are two things that I do.
So I guess I would add, agreeing with Glenn, you cannot let the immediate issues influence your long-term strategic plan. And so, for example, on 9/11, with my previous employer, we owned Columbia Center, the tallest building in downtown Seattle, right? One of the tallest on the West Coast. and after 9/11, there was great predictions that the high rise was dead, right? And if you would have made a strategic plan on that basis, it would have been a bad decision, right? And so I think I don't think COVID is going to be is going to ultimately influence our strategic plan as a company. This is going to occur. It's going to be solved in some way, and we're going to move on to a real normal, not a new normal. So I guess that would probably be the most important thing. I do think that the current issues related to disparity and race are permanent issues, not permanent problems, I think, but these are long-term things that need to be solved. And I think a strategic plan that isn't by any company that's not thoughtful about those issues is bad. I would encourage, I think that needs to be part of strategic planning for all the companies in the US.
I, again, supporting both what Glenn and Pat said, never underestimate our resilience. I think that's something which is going to be remarkably important. And also, quite frankly, don't make long-term decisions today. You can make those sometime next year. So adjust accordingly and what needs to be done to make sure everyone's safe today. Makes sense. But really, I remember, Pat, on 9/11 being in my office back then, which is the Wells Fargo Tower, in lockdown, looking around saying, okay, well, got the FBI behind me in the your building 3 blocks away, I'm getting out of here. But was it a permanent move? No, it was not. So we are resilient, we will get through this. And I would say address things as you need to today, postpone those bigger decisions for another year.
That's a great sort of final message there, Matthew. So thank you for that. What a great discussion today. Thank you all so much for your insights and your predictions and some of the details that you've shared today. Really fascinating stuff. I really want to thank Urban Renaissance Group for your support of this series too, Pat. Thank you. And thank you to John and Graciela for co-emceeing this with me. John.
Thanks, Emily. And Graciela, I saw you taking some notes there on what you took away from today's discussion. I want to ask you to close us out by sharing those and also previewing our next event coming up in September. And thanks again, Matthew, Glenn, and Pat.
Thank you, John. I will lead with this as a takeaway. Never underestimate our Seattle resilience. I haven't said it with quite the accent, but believe me when I say Seattle will not only recover, but will thrive. And as always, will lead the way in the future. Takeaways: restaurant reservations are down in Seattle from this time last year. Hotel occupancy rates are dismal. Please buy local, visit the downtown, continue to make those takeout orders, and support our local businesses, especially the small local businesses. Short-term pain is going to leads to longer-term gain. We're doing better than many other parts of the country, in large part due to the amount of office space leased by the big 5 tech companies, which represent, as we learned, 34% of office space in Seattle and the adjoining regions. We're way ahead of that game. There are still reasons to work together for training, productivity, innovation, and most people will return to the office when it's feasible. Expect our organizational cultures to change accordingly, but rather pivot, not be completely rewritten. We must rethink first floor space, street space, they called it, is necessary. This will allow us to reimagine what needs to happen, and perhaps with lower rent requirements, more investment by our investor community and BIPOC and other very specific businesses. I would encourage us to think about those kinds of things. Institutional investors have and are still interested in gearing up for 2021 in Seattle. Seattle's a safe bet, as Pat mentioned. The future of HVAC is an area of innovation coming out of the pandemic, straight from NASA's mouth, as relayed to us by the panelists. And expect this shift to residential construction to make houses larger to accommodate office spaces, as some of us are learning. you know, this is not a new normal. We've moved from pure crisis mode now to managed crisis, and we're making, but we are encouraged not to make strategic long-term decisions based on COVID. So those are your takeaways. A little longer this time. I usually narrow them down, but let's see. I wanted to remind everyone that this event is recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email from the the Puget Sound Business Journal, sorry, in case you missed anything. Register for our next Recover Seattle event on September 10th, which will focus on regrowing the economy in a more equitable manner. And again, really thank you all for coming. Thank you to the panelists, which were great for their insights, and please have a safe and wonderful day.